not just exist in discussions in the blogosphere. Unfortunately, that's still a wish, I think, for the future. I must admit, I think that we're wasting an awful lot of time in the meantime by a sort of fruitless war of words. That this is very prevalent in the training world. I don't know if it's true also in education. But there's a sort of battle between the rationalists on one side, who are the really serious people who analyze everything to death and want everything and inflict terminal behavioral objectives on people before they're allowed to open their courses, and who generally are a bit of a pain on one side of the world, but on the other hand, we have almost like the New Age, dimension to learning development, which is I always think it's sort of like crystals and this sort of thing, which is what really determines what we do, which is a very romantic view and wants to love everybody to death and teach them in the process. And somehow or other, both people are sort of missing the point. And I found this quote the other day, and this is why I think we're missing the point. I'll leave you to read this one. Because all these guys are assuming that we're just different brands of teacher. We're either going to teach them using, computers and instruct them and assess them and scorn them to death and all this sort of stuff, or we're going to love them to death. Or what we really mean is we want them to love us as teachers in the sort of romantic sense. And both of them have missed the point, I think. Now, what about right? We have got to do a bit of Gen Y because that's what it says on your program, and otherwise you'll sue. But, I think we have to say that there are new expectations, and the new expectations do come from new learners. I'm not so sure that those new learners are radically different from the ones that went before, but certainly there's an awful lot of press addressed at them. It's interesting, actually, to compare the different ways that people do talk about Gen Y. This is the sort of very positive way of looking at it. On the other hand, there's also a very sort of, sneering view that look at this selfish, very self-centered, group of people who you can't be trusted and are very unloyal. And somehow or other we have to reconcile these two sides to that. But what interested me what I wanted to find out was what do Gen Y people say about how they prefer to learn. And I found this particular list of items on a website which is called Barking Robot. Has anybody ever seen Barking Robot before? I thought if you don't have a slide with a credit to Barking Robot, then you're not really in this business, obviously. So what interested me was I looked down that list and I thought, hang on a minute, isn't that the same list that a chap called Knowles came up with about 20 or 30 years ago of the characteristics of adult learning? In other words, this is how adults prefer to learn. So I'm beginning to think that, this is how Gen Y likes to learn, but don't we all like to learn that way? And this is where Tom was absolutely right. The difference is that Gen Y is a bit more stroppy. In other words, they say what they like and they don't like, and they make it more obvious when they get bored, whereas we may have been more polite. I actually am not so sure they are that different. The technology is different, but not the people that different. Now, who is this one? Any guesses, anybody? Famous rock star? I don't know. Well, my sort of standard, way of addressing this issue of Gen Y is that, yes, we should obviously encourage change in the way that we teach and train people. That's obviously right. But we don't have to pander to a new generation. I think that, look, I was a child of the 60s, as you can see. Now, I was brought up, I'd like to think, on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I didn't get all of those as much as I would have wanted, but but nobody ever does, I don't think. But the fact is that when I went to work, I didn't expect my training program to be laced with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I realized I had to adapt and I had to fit in. And I think one of the interesting things about the Gen Y debate is that what does Gen Y do in a downturn? And I blogged about this earlier this year, and I got some very angry responses because I said, well, let's see how this workforce who like to change jobs every 3 months and everything, how would they react if there was, in fact, a shortage of jobs and too many of them looking for those jobs. And I got some very angry responses because people were saying, well, it's all right for you, a baby boomer, you created all this trouble, you're wishing bad things on the next generation. It's not fair. But I think that we have to be honest that at the moment, the problem of Gen Y is the least of the problems facing corporations and workplaces at the moment. It's the least of the problems, and let's face it, people are not going to be changing jobs every 3 months in the next few years. That will resume as soon as normal service comes back. Okay, so this is having an effect. These influences, new thinking, new expectations, will have an effect on the choices we make amongst what are very timeless methods. And I think we can see some obvious shifts there. Some shifts towards performance support, towards networking, towards sharing, towards collaboration, which is obviously a very positive thing. We should have been doing this all along. That's the interesting point. We all would have had a happier school time and a happier time at college. However, the reality is that in corporate learning and development, it's the pressures which are really taking their toll. And one of those pressures is the pressure of time. There's an interesting statistic here back from a few years ago saying that 72% of all training challenges are time critical. And that's very much characteristic of all work these days, but it's particularly true of training. I remember when I was first involved in training and development, you could take 6 months or a year to plan a program and to implement it. Now it's quite possible that you are asked to address a problem that day, at an extreme, and certainly within a week or 2 weeks or a month. In fact, the first definitions of this thing we call rapid e-learning was the production of e-learning materials within 3 weeks. I now think that would be an optimistic scenario, and that really we're talking about being able to meet training needs within days or weeks, because that's how quickly organizations are having to respond. And I think that it was the Queen, I think, the Red Queen in Alice Through the Looking Glass, who was saying to Alice that it seems like we're having to run ever faster just to stay in the same place. And I think that pretty well summarizes what it's like working in a corporation at the moment. Now, I don't know if Nick Shackleton-Jones is in the room. Is he in the room? But if he is, I stole this model from him with his permission, but I think it is quite helpful. And what it's telling us is that we really need to segregate the responses that we make, the interventions that we put in place for dealing with corporate training and development into at least 3 categories. We still need formal responses and top-down responses which address critical issues where we need to absolutely know that somebody has got a certain amount of knowledge or skill. We need to have some assessment of that process and so on. We need that when we've got time to do it. We also need a rapid response which allows us to create interventions. It might be just materials, videos, PDFs, or blog postings, or whatever it is, that can provide a quick response to learning needs. But as the pyramid gets bigger as it goes down to the bottom, we can see that we're absolutely depending on users, on individual employees, to make the rest of the learning happen, because they are the only ones who can respond quickly enough to fill the rest of the gaps in an organization. And this is essentially a mixture of top-down strategies and bottom-up strategies, and somehow or other an organization has to get this balance right. Interestingly, someone today called bottom-up strategies bottom-to-bottom strategies, which I thought was probably more correct because it's peer-to-peer, but bottom-to-bottom sounded like quite a risque concept, so I wasn't going to raise it. Unfortunately, I was tempted to raise it. We mustn't forget the fact that before this year, probably the greatest pressure on us as a world was, in fact, environmental pressure, and that's had to be put onto the side slightly at the moment. But it still is the biggest single argument that we've got for doing things online, is the fact that we're going to drastically reduce the amount of travel that people have to do to get around from place to place in their work. But we had to get to it. We had to get to it. The other big pressure is, of course, money. Now, Jay Cross is sitting at the front here, and he'll be pleased to know it's worthwhile being here, Jay, because I'm going to quote you here. This is a quote from a blog posting that Jay made just a few weeks ago, and it really struck me. This is the reality of the situation we're in.